it's the first thing everybody asks: Are you socialist? Are you Marxist? You went over and spent time over there. What do you think? And I tell you what I think. I think it doesn't work. I've been there.
G'day, y'all. This is episode number 4 of the Matt Sweeny Show. I talk with Richard Miller about his journey as an educator. Let's go. Well, hi, Richard. You and I caught up for coffee a little while ago, and I was just kind of curious, and you started telling me your story. And you mentioned that when you went to university, you were taught by socialist professors, and so you wanted to see for yourself what the truth is, and you went to the Soviet Union. And when I heard you say that, I'm like, I'd love to interview you. I mean, that's a fascinating story. And so you were kind enough to say yes, and so welcome. And really, I just want to give you an opportunity to tell your story because I think it's super interesting. And the kind of theme is like speaking the truth in love. And so thanks for being here.
Sure. Uh, well, thank you very much. If you don't mind, let's just take one moment and for just a moment of prayer, if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
I really my brain goes 200 miles an hour sometimes, and I would like God to just focus both of us on those things that He would like to communicate, and we'll leave it that there.
Amen.
So let me quickly lead us.
Okay.
Hey, Lord God, thank you for this chance to talk. Thank you for this chance to fellowship and communion over you. And Lord, we have interesting backgrounds, interesting experiences, but none is more interesting than you. So, Lord, as we share these things, help us to be humble in ourselves and to be honest and loving in our assessment of those things we've encountered in our lives, and help us to be more like you. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. So, why don't we go back to the beginning and you share your childhood?
Oh, wow. So let me give you a brief background. I had a household of two parents, one sister. My mom, who's really fascinating, is a Native Alaskan. She's actually a Native American, full blood, born in a remote village in Alaska. When she was pretty young, she was adopted out of there because she had a father who had TB and a mother who had alcoholism. And that's not a great combination for a kid to grow up in. So my mom was adopted out of Alaska by two very loving parents. I came to know them as my grandparents, really. So I actually have on my mom's side 2 sets of grandparents. And I'm very close to my family in Alaska, and I have some relatives right around here from my adopted grandparents. So my dad is a self-trained engineer. He grew up in a coal mining town, Hazleton, Pennsylvania. His father was just a bookkeeper, very bright and brilliant bookkeeper. He would sit there. I inherited, he had this set of books called the Harvard Classics. This is a set of books that was put together years ago by Harvard for recommended reading. And I could see as I read through the books, all the notes and margins. My grandfather was, oh my goodness. He was just a bookkeeper his whole life, but apparently he could have gone to Hopkins. Just never did. So bright. He was always, he loved books, and he was very intelligent. And I got a little bit of stuff from both my parents. I love books from the moment I could read. I was just always with a book. And I also loved math. Apparently, that came from my mom's side because we had a lot of mathematicians uh, up on that side of the family. It's fascinating, really. But I just had this thing for math. I got kicked out of class once because I could do my math problem set in class in about 10 minutes. It was a half hour and I'd be bored for 20 minutes. So eventually I did 2 years of algebra in 1 year in high school. And they said, Miller, we don't know what to do with you.
So
So,
tell me about high school and tell me about what you used to read and I guess that's sort of the like the
well,
phase
I
where
fell
you
in love
learn.
with Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau at an early age. These are two folks that were rarely influential in early America. Um, and certainly they're not without contention. Um, but they had a strong belief in individualism and a strong belief in nonconformity, um, and wrote some very famous essays. Um, I always read stuff from them, and I loved it. And but my teachers weren't all that comfortable with that. Of course, their job
So
is to organize a class and keep everybody in the same book at the same time, and I just didn't fit in. So I did get in a little bit of trouble and ended up in private school. It was the best environment for me, really. Um, and I finished out in private school. It was a private Lutheran school where they just showed me the love of God and helped me get through. At that point, I was pretty inquiring kid. I was always writing and reading about stuff. Um, and they just helped me get through that point in my life. So,
so you mentioned individualism. Um, what does that kind of mean to you? And if you want, I can speak to that. But just kind of curious about how that helped kind of form how you think about the
so
world.
um, I think I probably conceive of it a little bit different than those writers, and come on, I was 16. I probably was not able to think through all the nuances they had in mind when they were writing at that time. They were significantly more mature than I was. Let's be honest. My main goals really weren't to read too many books. I was 16. But what I've come to understand individualism is defining success on your own terms. Um, and that is, you know, not necessarily having this imposed upon you. And this is what makes you successful. And this is what makes you a member of our community. But to respect the gifts and the abilities that that person brings that are unique and adding color to your community in kind of more of a figurative way. Um, and so that's what I understand it as being, is respecting that person just because they are a person that has been created by God, gifted by God, and named by God. Um, Now, it's taken me 60 years to come up with this definition, so bear with me. And certainly all these things are in the Bible. God knew our name before we were even born. Um, and God gives us gifts. We talk about that a lot in First Corinthians. And lo and behold, that is the source of many different disputes. That was written, of course, because there were major disputes in the church at that time. But the whole book goes through the fact that, hey, look, there's a lot of different gifts given to different people, and you're all part of one body. Let's not corrupt this body.
So
So that's what I've come up with.
I like it. So when, thinking through your upbringing and high school, when is it that you actually became a Christian?
So I became a Christian at age 19. Um, I think I mentioned my mom was born in Alaska. My uncle ran a fishing business in the Bristol Bay of Alaska. You might have heard of the Bristol Bay of Alaska if you watch some of these commercials that talk about fresh caught salmon. Um, that's the Bristol Bay. That's where my family is from. So my mom said, I'm going to send them up to Nick. So my uncle Nick um, um, opened up his home to me and put me on his crew. And I worked on a commercial salmon boat for a while. And I lived actually in the native village to learn a lot about my native village ancestry that I didn't know anything about it. Um, and it started to kind of change my mind. And I will tell you, the first thing I learned, and this is hard. So at 19 in college, you're what they call a sophomore. And a sophomoric person, and I was sophomoric, has just enough education to think they know everything. And I was sophomoric, man. I had gone to college and I suddenly realized I loved learning and I loved college. And I could have arguments, just like any good college student. And my uncle had a fourth grade education because in native Alaska, that's what you got. But here's the thing, some missionaries flew in years before I was there and taught my uncle and my aunt how to read. Can you imagine that? My uncle knew how to read because some missionaries came in and they actually taught him how to read by using the Bible. And my uncle became a Christian. Not just a Christian, but a Baptist preacher. And darn, there's Baptists. They're everywhere. You can't. Why on earth is there a Southern Baptist in Alaska? Go figure. Anyway, my uncle was a Southern Baptist minister. And he drove me nuts. He loved me. And you got to understand. So I was in this generation of angry students and that were angry and we're raging because the world isn't what we think it should be. We want to change it. It's our job to change it. So it's our job to call up all the imperfections about the world around us. And my uncle loved me. And one of the things we called out is just instinctive. Some people would say it's taught. Some people would say it's instinctive. But, I was actually rebelling against organized religion at that point. But my uncle, he's a pastor and he's loving me. The only rule he really had is you had to come to church on Sundays. And so we would stop fishing even if the fish were running. And that's, you know how much money we lost one day because the fish were running and we were in church. But my uncle had that rule. You got to stop. And so we stopped. We went to church. But that night, we got back on the boat. And man, the winds are blowing. The winds are blowing. And if you've ever watched Deadly Catch, those guys are at the deeper part of the Bristol Bay. But when the winds blow in the Bristol Bay, it is horrible. We had a 30-foot boat, and there's close to 30-foot waves. And I literally thought I was about to die. So at that moment, I was no longer all that concerned about rebelling against the world. I just wanted to get the heck off that boat. And so I kind of understand some of the stories about the disciples. They're in the boat, they went fishing, and all of a sudden a storm comes on them. Except they're much smaller boats than the one I was on. But I was scared for my life. So when we got back to the shore, my uncle asked, so what if you had died? And he started asking me these really obnoxious questions. I don't know. So let's I've got a book here. Let's go and explore this. Let's see what this book has to say about what's you experience and what's going to happen if you die. And it was the Bible. My uncle knew the Bible pretty darn well. So we spent half day at least on the Bible and going through stuff. And we'd be sitting in the steam bath that way. And in Alaska, what they do in the spare time is they sit in this sauna or steam bath and they talk. And they just
Like a
talk.
sauna, like a hot steam
Yeah,
room. Okay.
yeah. We're just sitting there. He's talking to me. And he's talking to me about these darn eternal things. Um, and finally, I just said, look, I give up. Maybe God's right. Actually, God is right. um, now, that isn't to say that there was anything wrong with me being literate, me being occasionally critical, me asking questions about the world around me. That's still okay. But suddenly is a very different view about everything and a very different perspective and trust in the permanency of God. And suddenly, some things don't really matter quite as much. So that's how that happened. I would love to say it was a perfect transition from non-believer to believer. You know, it was a rough road. Coming back to school, being a different guy than you were when you left in May. Hey, let's get the revolutionary liberals back together. I'm not one anymore. I'm sorry.
So tell me about college. It sounds like you were the first in your family to go. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm what they call first generation because my dad never went to college, neither my mom. So first gens, we get into school and we know we made it into school, which is often, in the 1980s at least, a miracle in and of itself. And then the next step is knowing how to be a student. Now, I think I did pretty good on the student side. On the social side, I was starting to make a lot of pretty wild friends. My friends would sit around and smoke pot and say, "Oh, now I see the real world." Oh, good for you. Of course, it was illegal back then. I was actually, by the way, not much of a pot drinker or smoker. I could never stand not being in control of my mind. And they would say, "Oh, you got to let loose," and it's like, no, I can't do that. So I would hang out with them, but I wasn't one of them. Yeah, I was a first gen, and I made friends with a lot of folks that I'd say for the most part they were first gen as well. And most of them had hippie parents and pretty different view of the world than what my father would have had as a civil engineer and my mom as a legal secretary. So, you know.
So tell me
So,
about your professors at college and kind of how
well, in
this
the
trip to the Soviet
1980s,
Union came to be.
yeah. So, and let me preface this part of the story. In the 1980s, a very popular way of looking at things, at least in the social sciences, is through the eyes of Marxism. Now, there's two kind of steps in Marxism. One is an analytical framework. This is how we look at things, and we're using the concepts of power and class. So, and generally, the upper class power is taking advantage of the lower class power. So that is a major part of Marxist thinking. And then the second part is kind of more here's the kind of society we want to form. So, at minimum, my professors were using analytical frameworks of Marxism, and it was very, very popular in the 1980s. I would say it was a dominant paradigm in social sciences. So I got through college. Again, I was a real bookworm. I was a real thinker, and I always asked questions, and my professors loved them. And occasionally I would write pretty snarky commentaries, and they loved that too. I would say, what's so great about this thing, socialism? So I was actually taking Russian history at the time, and my Russian professor wasn't all that crazy about socialism. I learned later he was a Russian Jew, a descendant of Russian Jews, and he had his own reasons for not being much of a fan of that model. But in any event, my Russian professor then organized a trip, an opportunity for all of us, if we so desired, to go study in Russia. And I was like, wow, okay, this is the opportunity of a lifetime. And my dad told me, he says, look, you graduated, or you're about to graduate. But before you graduate, do you have anything you'd like? I'll get it for you. And I said, I want you to pay for my trip to Russia. And that's exactly what he said. Nothing. He was shocked. And as was my grandfather. My grandfather was in the military. My father was in the military. My uncle was in the CIA. So, wow. Okay. We had a family that was very dedicated to not liking Russians very much. And here's Richard saying, for my graduation present, send me there. Now, my dad's a very loving and kind guy, and he sent me there. In any event, and we had some guidelines and some training and all that. We had some basic linguistics, and we had some precautionary discussions, and here's what you do and don't do in Russia. But for the most part, we were left on our own to discover what's this place all about.
What year was this?
What's that?
What year was this?
1989. Or no, 1987. I just got the year wrong. It's 1987.
So this was Soviet Union before
Yeah, it
the
was
wall
before the
came
fall.
down. Okay.
Before the wall came down, and it was the Soviet Union, not
Yeah.
not Russia. So my particular itinerary, and they looked at our interests and matched us up with itineraries and places. So I went to, well, I started in Moscow, how most everybody does, because I had a lot of religious interests. They sent me down to Zagorsk. Zagorsk was home of the Orthodox Church, which is mostly a state-driven church at that point. But Zagorsk, and then I went up to Leningrad, now called St. Petersburg, and had some adventures there. And then I also went to Tbilisi, which is part of Georgia, which I would have to say was my favorite part. But so those were my primary destinations. But as I was there looking around, like in Moscow, so there was this big line. And there's this store called the GUM. The GUM is a big department center, a mall, when malls were the big thing. And there's this line all the way around the GUM. So let's see what the line is for. And lo and behold, there's people lined up for close to a mile to get a pair of shoes. I mean, come on. I can go right here to Shoe Warehouse and say, here's my shoe size. and they will bring me at least 50 shoes to pick from, you know? And here's people waiting for all day in their life, setting aside an entire day to get a single pair of shoes. And I was, wow, okay, it's something not quite working here. um, but one of the interesting things is everywhere we went, we had people asking us, could we help them get to America? If the place is so good, why do they want to come to America? So, any event, and actually, I'd say most of my classmates and my co-travelers came to the conclusion this place isn't really working all that well. And there's one more piece of evidence that I didn't even know about until I got back to the States. So when I got back to the States, my dad said, "Do you see the plane?" Now, if you look up in, I think it was May of 1987, this East German flew a biplane right into Red Square and landed right smack in the middle of Red Square. What's the significance? Well, Russia was supposed to have the most sophisticated air defense system in the world. And yet this German with a tiny little biplane got right through it and landed in Red Square of all places. And no, I didn't see the plane, but we were all forced out of Red Square. And lo and behold, it was on that day. Um, so, yeah, I saw the consequences of that plane. And my dad showed me a picture, and it was lo and behold, yeah, this is all starting to fit together. That's now I know what happened. So, yeah, the place was big, incredibly powerful, muscular, highly structured, rigorous, but it wasn't working. And, that was news. And so I came back. So are you Marxist? No. It's the first thing everybody asks. Are you socialist? Are you Marxist? I mean, you went over and spent time over there. What do you think? And I tell you what I think. I think it doesn't work. I've been there. So that was the most enlightening time I could recall. Where, and one of the great things about human beings is we have the capacity to change our minds about things. And certainly when confronted by the evidence, I could tell you that this method of organizing people and resources and money doesn't work. Now, a lot of my friends today will talk about, the market's not working, the market's not working. And I agree sometimes the market's not working, but what is the solution? Because I could tell you that system is every bit as vulnerable to corruption as our own. In fact, I'd say it's more vulnerable to corruption. After all, you're concentrating resources in one place. So, obviously it didn't work. So I came back red, white, and blue. I don't think anyone was surprised. My dad wasn't surprised. My uncle in the CIA certainly wasn't. My grandpa was relieved. So I had two offers to admission for graduate school. One from Loyola in Baltimore, and which is a good Jesuit school, and one to the University of Chicago. And I signed the University of Chicago because that was where all these Nobel laureates that I read in economics were from. And I wanted to study with the best. And so we went there.
So before we dive into to university, let me ask you about one aspect of your trip to the Soviet Union. Did you have, was there like a government appointed tour guide or anything like that?
So when you go to, well, at least in the 80s, contextualize this, of course, in the 1980s, when you went to Russia, you generally had to be supervised by a person that worked for this organization called Intourist. Intourist is the official Soviet travel agency. Uh, it's less of a travel agency, more of a control agency. What they want to do is ensure that you saw the best of everything and that it was being explained to you in their mindset and their framework. Um, it was pro-Russian or pro-communism. It certainly would tell you that Lenin was a hero. There'd be major statues of Lenin all over the place. Less so of Stalin. I think even then they were starting to recognize Stalin wasn't the greatest, but Lenin certainly was. Um, and it was their job to ensure that you saw the places in a positive light. The humorous thing is one of the people constantly asking me, could I help them give to America, was my interest guide, who really wanted to come to America.
Well, let me share kind of some thoughts with you. So the first podcast that I did was with the guest was G. Edward Griffin. And one of the things that he did now 41 years ago was interviewed a guy by the name of Yuri Bezmenov, who was
Mm,
a KGB agent who his role was to be a tour guide for prominent foreigners who came to the Soviet Union. And his job was to show them the best of the Soviet Union. Um, he ultimately fled the Soviet Union through India. He dressed up as a hippie and
mm,
escaped to Canada and then made his way to America. And he then did a series of interviews. And what I kind of took away is like where he basically delivered a warning to America. And in my words, kind of his warning was that the Soviet Union long ago realized that it couldn't defeat America militarily or economically. So it adopted a strategy of effectively trying to inject collectivism or socialism or Marxism into American institutions. Um, and he said that 80 to 85% of the KGB's budget went towards this effort. So it was funded with effectively unlimited, huge money. And the key targets of this, so it was an attack, and the key targets of this attack was religious institutions, educational institutions, and media institutions. But it also sought to undermine law and order and the family and the other kind of key institutions of society. And so I asked my first guest, Jared Griffin, about this. And like, is it true? Like you did this interview with this guy. What's your understanding of it? And he said yes, it's absolutely to his knowledge true. The key point that he added was that it was an attack from within. It was seeking to turn American institutions against the founding values of America through through Marxism, basically, which is what you described as seeing in the universities in 1980s. My second guest was then C. Bradley Thompson, who runs the Center for the Study of Capitalism at Clemson University. And I asked him, I'm like, what do you think of this? You've been in academia and higher education for a long time. And he said yes. His understanding is that this is true. It started in the 1960s, and it was a well-documented strategy called the Long March through the institutions. Um, and so I just find this really, well, I mean, I think it's really relevant today because it seems to me that what like Elon Musk and President Trump are trying to do is kind of uproot this a weed has grown, which we could call collectivism or Marxism in American institutions, and it seems like they're trying to uproot that. And you actually went to the Soviet Union and saw it, and you actually went through, universities that that were heavily impacted by Marxist ideology in the 80s. And so I'm very interested in just your opinion on this perspective of like perhaps this was by design, perhaps there was a concerted effort to inject Marxism into higher education in order to take it over from within. How do you kind of see that?
So I'm going to be a little more nuanced. Um, I'll be honest that it's certainly possible. So I'm not much of a, let's jump to more of a conspiratorial conclusion, but let me start with an economic market argument. Um, so when I was over there, do you know one of the cheapest things you could buy was a book? So the one thing I had to hand it to them is literacy was very high. Books were very popular and common, but of course the books were being controlled by one central press. So there was certainly an axis of control. There was certainly censorship, and they were certainly selecting things that were favorable to their view of the world. But those books were marketed at incredibly low price. I'll never forget. I went into a bookstore, because what's a nerd like me do? First thing I do is look for a book. So I go into the bookstores, and like, holy smokes, this book in America would be $100. Because I read academic books, and academic books cost a lot of money. I will never forget that part. But their books were so cheap. I could buy this incredible book for $3, $4, $5, and that same book would be $100 in America. So they certainly subsidize those books. Now, what's going to happen when you subsidize something? The demand for it goes up, and the consumption of it goes up, and more people are going to have it. So that would be a consequence of subsidizing. Now, was that subsidy intentional with those consequences and those results? Perhaps. I'll let someone else argue about that. But I know how to look at things from an economic perspective, and certainly with that subsidy structure, those thoughts, that framework of thinking was going to make its way over at incredibly low costs. And the other thing is they would promote tours of the area and look how wonderful everything is. But by the time I was there in the 80s, it was starting to not work. And I would say most of us there in the 80s were starting to recognize that. Was it kind of a wonderful, ideal world in the 70s? Maybe. So certainly my teachers had a high degree of regard for socialist thinking. Some of those people with socialist thinking, and by the way, Marx had some brilliant analysis of the failures of capitalism. He had a horrible solution. So that's where I sit in terms of the academic world. And what are my views? And yeah, go ahead and read it, but don't look at his solutions, because his solutions don't work. And it turns out even an imperfect competitive market is going to work more effectively than an allegedly perfect socialist market. And I say allegedly, of course, because it isn't perfect. Socialist markets aren't ever perfect, because you are going beyond equilibrium in the way you're doing things. And when you're beyond equilibrium, it will correct. This is something all economists know, and it doesn't matter what the orientation is. We know that the only stable point is this point we call equilibrium. And so to your question, certainly, it was a widespread belief that socialism could have been the answer. By the late 80s, I'd say there was also a widespread belief among the observers of socialism that maybe this isn't working as well as they thought it might work. And as you know, by the time we get into the late 80s, early 90s, everything was collapsing. So, for quite some time, the world was settled and the dispute was settled. That lo and behold, capitalism works better than socialism. I think we're probably bouncing back. And somebody's saying, oh, maybe we drew the wrong conclusions, and we'll see what happens now. But certainly, I would agree that, there was some degree to attempt to influence the way we think here.
Got it.
And I'd say the older the professor, the more likely they were to subscribe to those principles.
So tell us about the University of Chicago free market program that you studied.
I studied at the University of Chicago School of Public Policy. The School of Public Policy was founded by a hedge fund manager named Irving Harris. Of course, he's a hedge fund manager. He's a very wealthy man. We had three basic disciplines that we'd study. We'd study politics, we'd study statistics, and we'd studied economics. And we were basically swamped in those things very deeply. We were taught by Nobel laureates, which is really cool. We were taught by the best of the best. I took classes with a guy named James Heckman, who got a Nobel in a combination of statistics and economics. He reviewed welfare policy and found, lo and behold, that welfare creates an incentive. It creates its own demand. And so he was able to prove, using pretty reasonable numbers, that if you offer welfare options, people will figure out the best way to receive those options and drift toward it. So supply creates its own demand. I was taught by a guy named George Stigler, who is a very well-known free market champion. We had lectures with both Gary Becker, a free market guy, and Milton Friedman, who was at that time moving from Chicago to Stanford. Suffice it to say, our line of thinking was very free market oriented. That's just how Chicago thought. And when I studied it, the more I realized that mathematically, equilibrium is probably the best point. And the way you get to equilibrium is through a free market. We have rare instances of collective ownership, and that would be in things like roads or maybe emergency systems, for example, where it may be inefficient to organize private services. We've got a road here out in front of the university. If we made every road a private road, how would everybody be able to get here? Reasonable question. But even George Stigler would hold at some point that, why not? As soon as he asked that, why not, you started stumbling over your words. It was fun and it was engaging. Well, one thing I certainly learned is that liberty is a powerful thing. It's what encourages creativity, and it's no coincidence that some of the world's greatest new technology was invented here, might be built elsewhere, but it was invented here. Some of the world's, greatest products, all are conceived here. So I'm excited that that I'm part of that. So,
So did you read the great books like who like the great books of Western civilization? Like who were some of the philosophers, the writers, the economists that that you learnt the most from or that you thought were the most interesting thinkers?
oh my goodness. I happen to have one right here. I happen to be rereading George Orwell's Animal Farm.
Great book.
And for those of you not familiar, that it really kind of is taking on the revolutionaries and calling them, here are the ones that are going to take away all your problems and all your sores, and we're going to make the world better for you. And they're actually lying to you because the animals find after they go ahead and surrender control to these individuals that they become the very tyrants that they thought they were rebelling against. Uh, so uh, uh, that's just a sample.
What about Adam Smith?
Oh my goodness! Well, Adam Smith is great. It's not from the benevolence of the butcher that we have our dinner, right? So Adam Smith observed something pretty reasonable that, why do we have dinner? Well, is it because the butcher thinks butchering is cool? Well, maybe, but probably not. It's because the butcher is making money. He recognized the organization of labor, specialization, he recognized. And really, one of the coolest things, and it's underappreciated these days, but he understood the pyramid of economic value. For example, he even said he predicted that sporting contests would become one of the most valuable things in the world.
Did
And,
he?
and lo and behold, yes, it certainly did. Because everyone likes to share, it's called the theory or moral sentiments. He
Hmm.
outlines some of these things. And that, remember the excitement that comes from cheering for the winner, right? That creates a market in and of itself. Um, so Adam Smith did that. John Stuart Mill, of course, was our big champion. Um, and Mill was very much against censorship, silencing idea that it might sense or threaten us. I say John Stuart Mill was very prominent in our thinking, in our teaching. Um, and it just goes on and on. But we have never found something overwhelmingly that proves Adam Smith wrong, uh, which is a pretty strong statement.
A point you made, I think, over lunch was that Adam Smith is a moral economist as well. And so when people think about the morality of capitalism, how do his moral roots come into play?
Well, that's kind of the interesting thing because Smith went out and what kind of asking the question, how do we distribute goods and how do we, and he was very concerned morally with the outcome, that it be the best, that it be objectively, the highest distribution of goods possible. And so, as you noted, Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. He didn't actually consider himself an economist. He was a moral philosopher. So what's optimal? And it was, looking and observing this system of free trade that created the optimal outcome. And again, once, there's a whole discipline called welfare economics that we studied as a part of this. And we're using these little triangles that call social surplus. And so the degree to which somebody pays more than cost, that's surplus. But the degree to which cost is less than what somebody would have paid, that's also surplus. It's surplus for the consumer. and that if we add together surplus for the consumer with surplus for the producer, the optimal surplus is this point of equilibrium. And this point of equilibrium is accomplished through free trade.
So when you talk about equilibrium, because you've mentioned it a few times, you're kind of saying that. Can you explain what you mean by equilibrium?
Sure. The point at which we agree that a good would be exchanged for money or for some other consideration.
And so then the core point you're making is that capitalism is a more efficient, a better system to achieve equilibrium than
Sure.
any other system we've come up with.
Well, where we allow individuals freely to say, I value this item this much, and so maybe I'll pay that much. And this other individual says, well, I value it this much. And then lo and behold, they can find a place or a person that will accept what they offer. And that we allow everyone to set the price for themselves and to determine at what point, some of us, for example, might have a taste of, let's say, a Toyota Corolla, or some of us might actually have more of a taste of a Lexus. Okay. So each person has a different threshold in which they say, I enjoy it this much, and I'm willing to pay that much for this thing.
Got it.
And so each one of us has their own preferences. And so we call it interpersonal utility preferences, and that we don't actually second guess those interpersonal utility preferences. We accept them. And the only system that really accepts them as they are is the system of capitalism.
So when you teach the morality of economics, how do you go about teaching it?
Well, I ask students what do you think a moral system would look like? What do you think a moral system would look like? And then we could sketch it out even on the board. Uh, and how do we decide this? And how do we decide that? And we kind of walk through. Ultimately, and here's the thing: capitalism is when you let things happen on its own. Okay, whereas socialism is kind of constructed where we determine here's how much of this thing we're going to make, and here's the price we're going to charge, and that we're totally in control of this thing. And we're not necessarily setting the proper price. And that by unilaterally setting that price, we're totally ignoring the fact that consumers have different preferences. So you end up creating what we call choice errors. In any event, when I ask people, what do you think a good system would look like? More often than not, they'll say where everybody gets something. Does everybody need something? Well, maybe not. Okay, to the extent that you're giving something to everybody, no matter what, is that right? Or where everybody gets the same amount. Okay, well, that's called egalitarianism. And not even socialism is always egalitarian. So we examine some of the assumptions that you have and the statements you're making, and that is a system that does that actually a good system. I think the more you kind of draw it out to its logical conclusion, the more you end up finding that, again, a competitive equilibrium is the best point.
And when you go about teaching American government, how do you approach that?
Well, let me be clear. And I'm actually much more knowledgeable about American government than I am about economics. I mean, I went to great economics school, but I know a lot of more. I read this. Can you see it?
Yeah. Tilt it, angle it.
Oh,
There we
okay.
go. We can see it. The Constitution of the United States.
There we go. The Constitution of the United States, my favorite document. Let me be clear, it doesn't prescribe an economic system. Nowhere does it say this is a free market capitalism country. Nowhere does it say this is a socialist country. It doesn't say it's. However, when you look at the discussions that our founders had about this concept of trade, they were certainly very partial to the notion of free trade. And that they didn't really particularly appreciate, for example, a royal setting prices for everybody, because the royal could set a price that would be entirely inappropriate. And so they were certainly partial to open and free trade, which we would call capitalism.
Let me say that back to you in my own words. What I'm hearing you say is the founding fathers set out to constrain the power that the government has, to put limits on political power, and that it seems like the consequence of that is a free market economy.
Exactly. And in fact, they had experience. The United States, when it became a part of Britain, everything was determined by the royals. And that actually wasn't working all that well. It was causing friction. And they weren't always able to have adequate goods, or sometimes they'd have exorbitant price. They had a whole variety of market problems trying to meet the demand of just the tiny continent, original American market.
So, one other, just kind of while we're on the topic of kind of what you teach, your role is accreditation, right? So, like, what is accreditation, and why is it important for a university?
Oh boy, that's a loaded question.
Is it?
So, accreditation goes back quite some time. SACS is the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, where we have a body of peers that review us. Now, a lot of what they do, though, is dictated by the U.S. Department of Education. Whereas the U.S. Department of Education says, look, we only have so many people, so we'll make you be our minions. When you go over, make sure you check for this, this, and that. And so we have to have certain standards that we abide by. The problem is, it becomes a really big problem, actually. The uniformitarianism, and government only knows how to look at things in a uniform way.
Yeah.
That is expected from institutions is not necessarily the natural product of what we do. We don't all do things the same way. For example, I have some colleagues from a school out in Colorado College, that has classes that they do what they call the block plan. They do one class at a time. They're very different than the rest of us. And they would argue in their instance that somebody's going to have an intense learning experience. And it makes it very hard to accept because it's different than everything else. So there are, and certainly there are bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. who expect that everything would look the same and operate the same, look the same, smell the same, and serve the same students. Well, lo and behold, we serve a very different group of students than even our neighbor, the University of Tennessee. So accreditation is kind of looking at things and looking at the structures that we have and maintain and ensuring that we do things the same as everybody else. There's natural points of tension and friction. And this happens all the time at every institution, that not every institution does things the same.
So why? Like, why why? I mean, it seems like academics do not usually conform by nature, and yet what you've just described is a system of conformity, right? So, like,
Oh,
why
it's
is that the
it's.
approach?
I haven't had coffee yet this morning. Please don't do that to me. Um, yeah, you've got a very reasonable question.
Okay, all right.
Um, I, so part of it, we have to acknowledge that we have expectations levered upon us, and we spend immense amounts of time trying to take something that's circle and fit it into a square.
Okay.
Um, and and that's what we're instructed to do. That's the nature of our profession. Um,
So
so,
what makes a university is that it's accredited. But
so
accreditation brings a whole bunch of challenges with it, is what I'm hearing you say.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it starts with the very basic that you have faculty, that faculty have a curriculum, and that the curriculum has specified outcomes, and that the outcomes are documented. So these are very simple uh, building blocks, but once we start to get into the mechanics, is really when we start to have people start to say, "Why are you doing this different than the other people?" Um,
So let me ask you a question. I don't know if I'm not trying to ask you a load of questions. I'm just curious, but like if there's discussion in the news right now of potentially the elimination of the Department of Education. So if that happens, what happens? Does this just go back to the states and then the accreditation standards are defined at the state level, or what impact does
Uh,
that have?
what the argument is let's turn education back to the states. Now, I'll go back to the basics of American government. Um, so we have medical systems, for example, some of which are designed for low income, and some of which are designed for the elderly. The elderly um, is run by the federal government with uniform standards, and then we have a system that is designed by state governments with non-uniform standards, and that there are potential inequalities in between the states, which is why uh, we've seen the federal bureaucracy grow as rapidly as we have, because not every state is going to want to do things the same. Not every state has the same values. If you go up to Iowa or Minnesota, for example, a very different set of values uh, underlying that whole economy than something like Arkansas. So we're not all the same. We don't all try to accomplish the same thing. We don't all have the exact same standards as to what makes a society and what makes it functional. Now, we can agree on some basics, for example, that uh, success should not be race-based, or we could agree that success should not be age-based, or whatever. Maybe we could agree upon some certain principles and kind of make them broadly agreed upon federal principles. I don't know, but that was the primary argument for moving things up to the federal level, is that you have discrepancies going from one area to another. Uh, does that hold water? Certainly, I would say it does. But is it only resolved by the introduction of a federal mechanism? I'm not sure. I'm skeptical of that. Again, I think we're a little quick to believe that the federal government should be able to solve every single problem. Certainly the federal government is more effective at solving problems like national defense than individual states. Okay, if national defense is in fact national defense, but now let's list those things that is most effectively done by a federal system. And I'm not sure it always includes education. Some of the best education systems around, for example, homeschooled, were not originally regulated. And yet homeschoolers were winning the National Geography Bee every single year. spelling bees. If you go look at spelling bees, geography bees, huge numbers of homeschooled kids. And those are systems that were, for the most part, not regulated. So does regulation always make something good? No. Um, it doesn't make it consistent. Well, it could make it consistently mediocre. That's the risk,
Well said.
right?
Yes,
Um,
yes.
so, um, so that's the tension that we deal with when we discuss these questions. And I think it's legitimate to put the question on the table, you know. Um, and I certainly, I've got personal experience. I homeschooled all four of our kids.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. My oldest uh, actually became what they call a nuke in the Navy. He
Oh,
operated
cool.
a nuclear power reactor in a naval sub.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you don't want them making math mistakes. Um,
Is that like a Trident submarine? Is that what they call that?
uh, he worked on an SSBN, big missile sub.
Okay.
But and actually, my number three son is just getting ready next weekend, graduating from the Air Force,
Well,
and
congratulations. So,
he
so,
is going to be doing stuff too.
so tell me about how you approach that. I've got young kids. How do you think about how do you approach homeschooling well? Because it sounds like you've done it well.
Well, as a parent who is dedicated to spending time with the kids, I think I know the most about how my kids learn, why they learn, what motivates them to learn, what excites them when they're learning, and how to appeal to them and help them learn and be ready to participate in the world around them. Okay. So I have these goals as an individual, as a parent. And let's be clear, my kids at their young age don't even know what their learning goals are because they don't even know how to learn. So I set those goals. But I'm able to have a set of goals that is responsive to them as individuals because I know them. I'm their parent. Um, and so it's not ideal all the time. Let me be clear. Not everybody should homeschool. Um, but we found we were excellent candidates for homeschooling. Every one of our kids, and my second son went to Harvey Mudd, which is the hardest college in America to get into. Just go look at it sometime. Harvey Mudd. It's over in the Claremont, California area. And he studied math. But, he liked math. And boy, I just made math an area of discovery for him. And we never put up a barrier for him learning. And say, oh, whoops, time's up. Sorry, you got to stop learning math. You got to go on to this next thing. We didn't do that. But yet, our kids learn respect for their neighbors, love for their neighbors. They lived overseas, so they learned to be part of a world that's radically different from their own. They learned to have respect for that world. They learned foreign languages for the most part, 3 out of 4. They they learned a lot of things that made them healthy and productive in the world around them. They did not live in isolation. They were active. So the biggest thing I had to do is invest time and invest time, which, by the way, is costly, folks. Number 2, inject values. Pray about your values. Sincerely pray, because not every value is a good value. So instill upon them those values and encourage them to explore. And lo and behold, every one of my kids did well. And we did a lot of reading. I mean, reading was the heart of everything we did. And then math was probably our second heart.
So did you take a step back and define the learning outcomes, define the curriculum, or did you just kind of go with the flow?
No. Every day I wanted to learn I wanted them to learn something that they did not know the day before.
I like it.
Could I document learning outcomes? Yes. Okay. And could I sit them down for a standardized test and show that lo and behold, they test better than everybody around them? Sure.
No, but what you
does
just
that really
said,
prove anything?
no, what you just said really is resonating with me. Every day, you want them to learn something they didn't learn the day before. That's powerful. That's a great like philosophy of homeschooling. Is that how you thought about it day to day?
Yeah,
I love that.
every day.
That's awesome.
Now, I have to be honest and candid. Could I take that down to my colleagues in Sachs and get that to pass? No.
Understood.
So I'm a little bit of a conundrum because, it's my job to conform to their expectations. And I'll be honest, the way I raised my kids and educated them, I've had a very hard time doing that. But yet the results speak for themselves. 3 out of my 4 kids earn twice as much as me.
That's a good sign.
Well, it's a starting statistic. That's not, hey, it's just a number. Does a number really mean much? Well, if you listen to rhetorics today, the main point of whole education is to get a job. And I happen to disagree. I think it's more than just getting a job. I think it's being a member of a community.
And your values, yeah.
Yeah, and to be a place that can spread those values and share those values. So a conduit, if you will. But that's not even covered in the standards. So in any event, there's a little natural struggle in between what I do and what I've lived. But I can figure out somewhere along the line that there's a way to do both, and that's that's why I get paid.
You published an article, Colleges Need Backbones of Freedom and Liberty. So why? What point were you making there?
Oh, so about a year ago, there was a big argument in higher ed. Should we limit the stage to experts? And there is some folks from Arizona who are advocating. And they had written the original article that we should only allow experts to speak. Well, wait a minute. Well, who's defining who an expert is? Right. But let's start and ask some reasonable questions. Okay, let's try that rule. Experts only. Who in history would we have knocked out by saying experts only? Well, you wouldn't have genetics. Genetics was discovered by a monk who was watering his plants and happened to notice, oh, look, the colors are interesting. Maybe I should document these. He wasn't an expert. He wasn't a certified horticulturalist. He just observed, if I got this number of white plants and this number of red, and then next year I look at the difference, it suddenly has an interesting pattern. He wasn't an expert. The guy who invented the chronographer, these are clocks that keep precise time, he was a carpenter. The Royal Society was like, who invented it? Benjamin Franklin, brilliant. Benjamin Franklin was brilliant, okay? He solved a lot of problems using math. He wasn't a recognized expert in a lot of the areas that where he's like, was he known to know anything about electricity? No, he discovered it because he just touched a ring that happened to have a kite and got shocked in a big way. Thomas Edison, was he an expert? These are just guys who had interesting questions, and they were obsessive and persistent about investigating those questions. Expertise did not even exist when these people were doing what they were doing. Uh, so, what's the effect of eliminating expertise? Or only insisting upon expertise. Sorry, taking away non-experts from everything and not allowing them to contribute. Well, I can tell you, you're going to miss out on a lot of stuff. The other thing is, it's totally anti-ethical to our founders. Our founders built a society that was inclusive. They were not building this thing that says experts only. They were building something where anyone could productively be a part of it. So and it had balances and it had controls, and either you or I could actually write letters to our congressperson and stand up and give testimony to Congress. If that's why we have the system we have, is it provides for a variety of input. So I absolutely disagreed with the premise of these authors, and our friend, he says, good one. So and then the author said, I'm not sure he understood what we were trying to say. Well, I understood what they were trying to say. There's a lot of places that would not consider me an expert because, after all, I only have a master's degree. So, what is expertise? So that's where I was when I wrote that article, and it was actually pretty well received. The Chronicle published it, and I was excited. And really, you think about something like our institution, we have a lot of great people who are contributing knowledge and contributing encouragement to students well beyond what their original expertise was.
You mentioned Benjamin Franklin there. You're a collector of something, aren't you, in relation to Benjamin Franklin?
Oh, I collect. I'm a numismatic collector, which means I go after medals and coins and things like
Okay.
that. But Franklin is probably one of my favorite topics. I have over 300 pieces right now.
Huh.
And it's an interesting collection. It starts back in the 18th century, when Franklin was born. Franklin was actually a rock star over there in France when he was there. He was an ambassador to France. He probably spent more time in society than he did in the royal courts. It drove some of his colleagues nuts, but he's actually far more effective than his colleagues at pursuing his goals. And it certainly, his goals included a variety of things. But he was highly effective in bringing the United States and England to a truce. He was highly effective at arming the United States in its defense against England. He is a well-respected participant in the world around him. So I have a kind of secret adoration of Benjamin Franklin and collect lots of pieces that speak to that.
Very cool. So
Mhm.
you experienced a Great Books program, and so I had this idea to take two things. One is a Great Books approach to what I call the philosophy of freedom. And what I mean by that are like, what are the key principles that, as we track them through the history of Western thought, drove the founding fathers from, logic, right? Back to Aristotle, like what is logic, through to individualism, which we've talked about, through to the principles of capitalism and Adam Smith. So piece one is sort of a great book's approach to the philosophy of freedom. Piece two, and the idea is to combine this with a second piece, which is practical entrepreneurship. And so my background is I spent the last 10 years running a technology company. Went through Y Combinator and a number of other accelerator programs, and sort of learnt the practical approach to how do you come up with a good startup idea? How do you test the idea? What types of customers should you go after? How do you start generating revenue? If it's going well, what type of company do you incorporate? How do you should you raise money from investors? If so, how do you raise money from investors? And so I had this idea of combining these two things, the philosophy of freedom with practical entrepreneurship. And this whole thing is improbable to the point that you just made. First of all, because I'm an Australian talking about American history. And then second of all, because I've got a bachelor's degree at a university, right? So, but, my first step was sort of forging this partnership, and we partnered with Tusculum University. The second step was getting it funded, and we exceeded our funding goals. And then the third step was getting it sort of a program built around it and it approved, and that's done. Now the fourth step is enrollment, and we're on track to far exceed the original enrollment goal for the program. And so it's launching in fall. And I think it's exciting because, I think it's exciting for two reasons. One, I have this belief that if, like, I call it, well, others have called it philosopher builders, right? So if we can teach people to be entrepreneurs and they're grounded in philosophy, I think not only can they be successful entrepreneurs, but they can create companies that actually have a positive impact on the world. Number one. And number two, it's an opportunity to start a real company while you're at college. And we're going to be helping that, encouraging that, mentoring that, and arranging a pitch day to support that. And so, like, the idea is come to college for an education, but graduate with a business. Um, and so, as someone who has experienced the Great Books program, and also you've got, we didn't really touch on it, but you've had entrepreneurial experiences as well. And as someone kind of sitting sitting where you can have probably a better view than most of the direction of higher education, what do you think of this program? And do you have any advice for me about what I need to do to try to make it successful?
Well, I think what you're saying is kind of exciting. And right now, I'll tell you the common rhetoric in our world is that people are coming to school to get a job. I actually disagree. I believe people come to school to have a future. A job's part of that future. Um, Certainly, and for a long time we were negligent in paying attention to the job applicability of what we are teaching. Okay, it's an admitted deficit in what we're doing. However, um, all that said, um, people come here for a future. Um, what you're describing is kind of exciting to me because the great books are not just about a specific discipline; they're about life, and understanding how to confront life and how to live that life and what values to adapt as you're trying to work yourself through the murk. And this is stuff that everybody encounters. It's common stuff. Um, and the greatest books are the ones that deal with the most common dilemmas. And, and we should be able to speak intelligently about these common dilemmas. Uh, so um, I like the idea. Um, and come to school for, an education, that's cool. And leave with a business of your own. That's even more cool. I will tell you, not every business is going to succeed. I got into the idea. I lived overseas for a while, and I wish we could talk about that. That's another day. Um, but when I lived overseas for 4 years, I got into this Oriental carpet stuff, And I learned a lot about Oriental carpets. Uh, I could tell you the difference in between a Turkish rug and a Persian rug and a Kazakh rug and a Turkmen rug. And I knew all the different areas that were rug producing nations, the method they used to create the rugs, the material they would use. And then, even beyond that, what does it tell you about the life of the people who are making the rug? And that's why I loved it, because it drew me not just to the mechanics like an old machine made rug, but to the actual person who made this with their hands. And I love that business. It was great business. Problem is, I love the rug so much, I was a horrible businessman. And I'd sell well below the equilibrium price. And only because I got enjoyment out of talking to people about the people who made the rugs. And because I got enjoyment, I would discount them again and again and again. Shame on me. Hey, I have to admit, though, I still got utility out. And that's what the economist was worried about, is utility. Did you enjoy it? Yeah. Well, and it all works out. Yeah, but I went broke. I think that's a great thing to do, because students do have a lot of capacity to define success on their own terms. When you look around, everything is presumed. These big corporate systems that have a very specific recruiting path and all that. Hey, they're great. I'm glad they're here, but not everybody fits in that mold. Okay, not everybody does that. And one of my favorite students here, his name is X. He started his own business, and he can fix anything. He's a handyman, and he's really motivated. And what can I do to help you? He's always there, and he's a great entrepreneur, to be honest. He's building a company out of his motivation. And this is his own company. And you could tell it's his company as soon as you see its ad and you meet the people associated with it, because they've got that drive. Okay. And that's not something you can put into a formula. You go to as many Tom Peters seminars as you want. You'll never be able to do it unless you meet this guy. So it's very unique to him. So I'd say go for it. See what happens. It's exciting.
Just kind of, what do you think universities look like in the future? I mean, these institutions have been around and very much the same, I think, to correct me if I'm wrong, but very much the same, I think, for a long time. Do you think they keep looking like this, or do you think they look different in the future?
Well, let's start with the biggest and the best and the richest. Okay. They're going to go on their own darn path. They've got the wealth and the resources and the alumni support to define success and step out of the system anytime they want. They're still in our systems. They still do. In fact, many of these administrative systems that we're required to maintain are maintained to their advantage, because they've got the size that they can afford those kinds of structures. And a school like ours, when we've got 1,300 students, we can't really afford the same structures as they have, and yet we are compelled to do it as a regulatory matter. So now we have to meet those standards set by a much larger school. But in the future, we are having circles run around us by non-accredited organizations that offer learning without offering degrees. And those organizations are growing rapidly. Do I think they're the ultimate answer? No, I don't. I still believe in a university education. I still believe in having a well-rounded liberal arts foundation and being able to question the world with certain understandings. from each one is a different angle. Kind of think of it as maybe a Rubik's cube, and you kind of turn the cube around and okay, today is red, another day it's green, another day's yellow, and you look at it from that angle, right? But so that's what we're doing in a liberal arts education. And I think it's valuable. It's worth standing up for. It's worth supporting. But right now, I'll tell you, most people are not supporting that. Most people are also going to these alternatives. There's a huge flow of students to alternatives because of this whole idea that I'm defined by what my job is. The job is a major part of who you are, no question about it. But who you are is much bigger than that. I go back to my grandfather, brilliant man. He read the great books. My grandfather never went to college, but he understood the great books and could talk about them fluently. So remember my uncle. My uncle had a fourth grade education, but he was way wiser than me. So there's just things that are outside of these structures that we're talking about that we're totally missing as we're kind of getting into ideology and our doctrine of what represents education. And we're so stuck on that, we're not responsive when somebody says, is there a different way to do this? So
why are these alternatives growing so rapidly?
They're fast. They give you quick. There's a book by a guy named Stuart Brand. Stuart Brand was a hippie back in the 60s. He's actually a very conservative dude now. But Stuart Brand wrote this book, The Clock for the Long Now, and this whole concept of now. Okay, what do you mean when you say now? And it used to be now could be defined by, a period of a month. And you'd say now, and people understand that to be a month. And then you go now, and then it'd be about a week. And then you'd say now, and now it's a day, or now it's even a second, right? This whole concept of instant gratification is very destructive on education because what people want is that as fast as possible, that credential that's going to give them this job and this career. But you know what? Most jobs and careers that are going to grow in the future don't even exist today. So how can we train you for it? What we can do is train you to learn and be ready for that new career when it emerges.
Or to train you in the foundations and enable you to create that new company.
Or you can create it. Yeah. I'm fine with that too. Kudos to you. That's this whole idea of I need to fit into this right now. That's actually very short-sighted. And that's a system that we're being asked to build to by government bureaucrats, even by parents who believe that the government bureaucrats are right. So, that's a puzzle, and it's actually a major challenge to us.
Well, that's been super interesting learning about your journey and your perspective. Anything else that I should ask you about or that you want to add?
Oh, no, I think that's covered so much. Let's get back together sometime. I'll tell you what it's like to live overseas, although I'm sure you understand since you're living overseas.
Well, this is home now, but yeah, no, absolutely. I'd love to hear about your overseas journeys.
And why I think it's a beneficial experience that everybody should do.
Where have you lived? Where have you lived?
Well, I lived in the United Arab Emirates for 4 years. But while I was there, I traveled to just about all of the Arabian Peninsula. I have traveled a lot of Europe, mostly Southern Europe, in the Mediterranean region. I dabbled a little bit with Germany. I think just getting outside of that comfort zone for a couple of years is essential for everybody. There's a lot of wisdom to different organizations that really highly encourage that. So one of these days, let's talk about that.
Great.
But it just again, it forces you to be learning ready, and for me, that's exciting. But hey, I enjoyed our time together today. Let's do it again.
I enjoyed the conversation. Sounds good. Take care. Thank you.
Give care. We'll see you.
This episode of the Matt Sweeny Show is open sourced under the MIT license. You are free to download, use, copy, modify, merge, publish, distribute, sublicense, sell. Yes, you can use it commercially, so long as you include this notice and link to mattsweeneyshow.com. Thank you to my beautiful wife, Tusculum University, listener kids, and our contributors for making this episode possible. Support freedom and more episodes like this by contributing at mattsweeneyshow.com.